As I understand it, nuclear reactors work somewhat similarly. At least the original prototype was. We put these uranium rods into water. It heats up the water, and we basically create steam power from these magic rocks, as it were.
Yep.
Is that kind of the general principle? And is Valor Atomics doing something different?
Yeah, so that is how 90+% of the world's nuclear reactors operate today. Is, yeah, exactly like you said, uranium in water. The water gets very hot. We use the steam to turn a turbine. That turbine turns a magnet inside a generator, and that produces electricity that we then consume. Now, that was actually not the first type of nuclear reactor ever made. The first type of nuclear reactor ever made, the Chicago Pile 1, was actually a graphite reactor. So, real quick, the principle of nuclear, nuclear physics and energy generation, you have atoms which get bombarded by neutrons, right? And these atoms are called fissile, which means that they can undergo fission. And they can undergo fission if they get hit by a neutron. And when that happens, they produce more neutrons, right? So when a U-235 atom gets hit with a neutron in the right conditions, it will split, produce two more neutrons. And those two can, hit two more. Now you've got 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, and you're off to the races with an exponential reaction. Now, eventually that exponential reaction tapers off and you get an effective multiplication rate, and it tapers off because of various effects like neutron absorption and leakage. But you eventually have a steady neutron population where the U-235 is being consumed by fission, and those neutrons are actually kinetically interacting with the moderator, and that's producing heat. And so you have something heating up, and then you remove that heat through some sort of fluid, and you consume that heat into a turbine and produce electricity. Now, the moderator I talked about there is, it's called a moderator because I missed a little part of what I just said, or I intentionally removed a little bit of what I just said. So when a neutron leaves a U-235 atom, it's actually traveling too fast to cause another fission event, right? So you have the atom split, neutrons come out. Those neutrons are actually moving too fast to cause more U-235 fission, at least effectively inside of a nuclear reactor. So you actually need to slow those neutrons down. The way that you slow neutrons down is called a moderator. And essentially what happens is that these neutrons contact other atoms and they scatter around randomly. And each time they lose a little bit of their speed, they lose a bit of their energy, and translate that to heat in the moderator. And eventually they become slow enough, they enter what's called the thermal spectrum. Now they're slow enough that they can actually, when they contact another U-235, they can actually split it, right? So in the current nuclear fleet, that moderator is water. It's actually the hydrogen in water. Hydrogen is a very effective neutron moderator. But the first reactors, they use graphite. So carbon is also a pretty good neutron moderator as well. You can scatter neutrons around in carbon. It'll absorb the energy, and eventually those neutrons will be slow enough, cause more fission in U-235. So the first reactor is called the Chicago Pile 1. It was a graphite reactor. The second one was sort of a rebuild of the Chicago Pile 1 called the CP2. And then eventually we made the X10 reactor. And after that, we started to build water reactors. And the reason that we did that is essentially that they're more energy dense, right? So energy dense means how much energy do they make per size. So essentially you can make a light water reactor a water moderated reactor smaller. And that was really important because we needed to fit them inside of a nuclear submarine. And so that's kind of where we went down the water moderated path. But the type of reactor that we're making here, let's see if I get my wrong shoulder here. This behind me here, this is Ward 0. It's our prototype reactor. This is entirely graphite. So we don't use water to moderate the neutrons. We use graphite, just like the very earliest nuclear reactors. And we do that because it's fundamentally safer. It's a lot safer than water moderated reactors. We use helium as the coolant, and that's super important because, a bunch of different reasons that we can talk about. But yeah, we're sort of going back a little bit in order to go forward.
Interesting. Why is it safer?
So the safety here comes from a couple of different things. The general safety principle of a nuclear reactor is that you want the effectiveness of the reactor or the neutron population to moderate itself, right? So as these neutrons become more and more populated in the core, there's more neutrons, more fission occurring. You don't want that to be exponential, right? Because if that's exponential, what you're looking at is a nuclear bomb, right? A nuclear bomb is essentially somewhere where you have exponential growth of neutrons in a very, very short period of time. and it's essentially a heat explosion, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of that, you want the neutron population to grow and then taper. And the way that it tapers is called negative thermal feedback. And what that means is as it gets hotter, the population gets lower, right? So the hotter the core gets, the worse it should get at producing more neutrons, so that at a certain temperature point, you just have sort of a stable population.
Right.
And this kind of works with water moderation, but it doesn't work great. You can actually still have neutron runaway in a water reactor, and so the control rods in a water moderated nuclear reactor are part of the safety system. Meaning these control rods are boron carbide rods. Boron absorbs neutrons very well, and so you sort of stick them down into the core. They absorb the neutrons, and the reaction either slows or shuts down. Our reactors work a little bit differently. We still have control rods. They're at the top of this thing. You can't quite see them. They're right up here. But the control rods are for control, but not necessarily for safety. So what that means is if you completely lost control of the control rods and they were full out and the core was just allowed to run, what would happen is that the core would heat up. It would continue heating up, and it hit a certain temperature at which the neutron population actually just dies to zero. And the reason for that is that moderators, as they heat up, become worse and worse at moderating. Right. So as carbon heats up, there's a lot of thermal energy, right? So there's a lot of kinetic motion, kinetic energy, there's a lot of motion.
Right.
And the neutrons actually can't slow down anymore because the carbon atoms are already so high in kinetic energy, if that makes sense. Because the principle is that you're wanting to transfer some of the kinetic energy from the neutron into the carbon. But if the carbon already has a lot of kinetic energy, it's much harder to slow that neutron down. And so there's this basic safety principle called negative thermal feedback, where as the core gets hotter, the neutron population, the KF actually gets worse and worse. And
Interesting.
and then the other thing with this type of reactor is that we don't use water as the coolant. We use helium. And helium does not get activated by neutrons, meaning it doesn't capture neutrons and become radioactive. This is unlike water. Water will capture neutrons as it's going through the core, and the water itself will become radioactive. So a leak in your nuclear reactor coolant is actually a radioactive release for a normal nuclear reactor. For ours, it's not, right? Helium is completely invisible to neutrons. So there's a couple ways that this is much safer.
Yeah. So basically, the principle is once it gets hot enough, because either your rods are full up or your moderators worn out, fission is no longer possible because they're moving too fast. Is that correct? Am I understanding that?
So it's not so much of the moderator becoming worn out. It's that as moderators heat up, they just don't moderate neutrons as effectively.
Worse at their job.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so as if the moderator were to cool back down again, right, then you would have this increased neutron population because it would increase in effectiveness. And so you have this equilibrium, right, where there's a certain temperature at which you'll be maintaining. And in fact, the Chinese built a reactor that's very similar to this a couple of years ago, and they actually tested this. So they actually turned off the coolant, and they pulled the rods, and they just watched the reactor to see what would happen. It did exactly what we're talking about here. It raised to a certain temperature in the core. The neutron population completely died out due to lack of moderator effectiveness, and it safely shut down on its own.